Okay, so wow, you guys have really given us a ton of information to go through this time.
Yeah,
A lot of articles, reports, all focusing on, uh, you know, the major conflicts that we're seeing globally.
right.
And so for this deep dive, we thought it would be a good idea to just kind of get right into it,
Yeah,
and take a look at some of the key wars that are expected to continue through 2025.
right,
And, you know, what are the possibilities that these sources suggest in terms of how they might be resolved?
right.
And, just as a reminder, we are pulling from places like the Council on Foreign Relations, Wikipedia, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, all current as of March of this year.
Exactly. And it's amazing as you sift through this material,
Yeah.
it's really striking how many significant conflicts there are with no clear end in sight.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the Israel-Hamas war, obviously the ongoing situation in Ukraine,
Right.
the crises unfolding in Sudan and Myanmar,
Right.
the persistent tensions in Ethiopia, and then just widespread instability across the Sahel region.
Yeah, it's
And each of these conflicts has already led to, just immense human suffering.
yeah.
Huge numbers of lives lost and people displaced from their homes.
Yeah, it's a really concerning picture, I have to say. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I thought was so interesting that just jumped out at me immediately was how interconnected all of these conflicts seem to be.
Yeah,
They're
absolutely.
not isolated events at all.
Right.
For instance, the tensions that we're seeing in the Middle East have repercussions that extend far beyond that region.
Absolutely.
Significantly impacting things like global energy markets, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, I guess we should just kind of jump right in then. Let's start with the Middle East.
Yeah, so the Israel-Hamas war, unfortunately, is projected to continue through 2025.
Right.
Your sources mention over 3,091 fatalities
Wow.
already just on Wikipedia.
Wow.
And what's particularly worrying is the widening scope of this conflict
Okay.
beyond Gaza itself.
Right.
We're seeing increased clashes in the West Bank and also a growing involvement of Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon,
Okay.
which, raises the very real threat of a much larger regional war.
Right.
Hezbollah, by the way, is a powerful political and militant group based in Lebanon.
Right. And it seems like Iran plays a pretty significant role here.
Huge role, yes.
The CFR highlights that even though Iran is facing internal vulnerabilities and a degree of international isolation,
Right.
they're still actively supporting these proxy groups like Hamas and Hezbollah.
Yeah.
And it seems like, this support network makes it really hard to imagine, any prospects for peaceful negotiation.
Absolutely.
What do you think? Why do they continue to provide this support even when they're facing these challenges at home?
Well, that's a crucial question.
Yeah.
And the CFR suggests it's likely a combination of factors.
Okay.
Ideologically supporting these groups aligns with their regional ambitions
Right.
and their anti-Israel stance.
Right.
But then strategically, these proxies provide Iran with leverage
I see.
and the ability to project power without direct confrontation.
Right.
So even with the internal pressures, this strategy of regional influence remains a key tenet of their foreign policy.
Okay.
And the CFR also points to this high likelihood of direct escalation between Iran and Israel,
Right.
which could involve missile strikes and cyber attacks,
Wow.
which would, further destabilize the entire region.
Yeah. So, with all of that in mind, I'm just kind of curious,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on how any of these conflicts could potentially even be resolved?
Well,
I mean,
it's a great question.
it seems impossible, right?
Yeah, well, the initial steps we often see
Yeah.
are these attempts at temporary ceasefires
Right.
with international actors like the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar trying to mediate.
Right.
But, as we know, those are often just short-term fixes.
Yeah.
Achieving any kind of lasting peace really requires addressing these fundamental core issues.
Right.
The future of Gaza, the status of the West Bank,
Right.
and, the incredibly sensitive issue of Jerusalem.
Right.
The idea of a two-state solution is frequently mentioned,
Yeah.
but it feels increasingly difficult to envision.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
So what do you think realistically?
Well, realistically, we might see these temporary pauses in the fighting,
Okay.
but the underlying tensions are so deeply entrenched
Right.
and so volatile
Yeah.
that the conflict could easily erupt again.
Yeah.
And as we discussed, if Iran or Hezbollah become more directly involved in a major escalation,
Right.
we're looking at a much broader regional war with devastating consequences.
Right.
And it really underscores how this conflict alone can have such a significant ripple effect
Uh-huh.
on something as critical as global energy supplies.
Right, because of the oil.
Because of the region's oil importance.
Right, yeah.
If you're finding this insightful, by the way, make sure to like this deep dive and share it with your friends.
Oh, yeah. Good point. Good point, guys. Okay, so let's shift our focus a little bit
Okay.
eastward to the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah,
Just the sheer scale of the human cost is horrifying.
it is.
Wikipedia indicates over 17,000 fatalities in 2025 alone.
Wow.
And data from ACID just paints such a stark picture. It shows a massive 63% increase
Yeah.
in the average number of monthly battles in 2024
Right.
compared to the previous year.
Yeah.
And it just seems like Russia is steadily gaining ground.
Yeah, that increase in fighting coupled with Russia's territorial gains really highlights the very difficult and draining situation for Ukraine.
Right.
And the sources also point to another kind of concerning trend, and that is a growing sense of exhaustion within Ukraine.
Right.
And, kind of a shifting political landscape internationally.
Yeah.
The upcoming U.S. election, for example, introduces significant uncertainty regarding the continuation and extent of Western support.
Right. Yeah. With all of that backdrop, it seems like
Yeah.
that makes it really difficult to imagine how there could even be any kind of negotiation.
Absolutely.
It feels like we're kind of caught between this very real possibility of a frozen conflict
Right.
where, the fighting just continues.
At a lower intensity.
At a lower intensity, but, without a resolution.
Yeah.
Or even further devastation if the conflict escalates.
Right.
So given this really challenging context, what do the sources even suggest as potential paths to resolution for Ukraine?
Well, the most theoretical path, of course, is a negotiated settlement.
Right.
However, this would likely involve significant and politically sensitive territorial concessions from Ukraine.
Yeah.
The other potential path is, a continuation of the fighting,
Right.
which, as you pointed out, risks a prolonged stalemate and even greater destruction.
Right. And it's just so fascinating to me to observe how much Ukraine's ability to resist even depends on this external aid,
Totally. Yeah.
which is just crazy.
I-
So, that leads us to some pretty realistic outcomes, which are pretty sobering.
Yeah.
A frozen conflict seems increasingly likely if there can't be any kind of meaningful negotiations established.
Right.
And Ukraine's just ability to sustain its resistance is so heavily reliant on that Western support,
Yeah.
which, as we mentioned, might not be guaranteed in the long term.
Right.
And this high rate of battle that we were talking about, it just suggests that there's so much potential for prolonged devastation.
Yeah.
And it also, I think, raises some serious questions about the future, cohesion and unity within NATO.
Absolutely.
What are your other opinions, guys, on the Russia-Ukraine situation?
Yeah. Let's know in the comments.
Leave those in the comments. Okay, so
So let's shift focus a little bit again
Yeah.
to these often less discussed but incredibly serious situations in Myanmar and Sudan.
okay,
In Myanmar, the reported fatalities have already surpassed 3,300 in 2025.
wow,
And according to ACLID, a particularly concerning development is this growing strength of the resistance movement.
okay,
They are reportedly consolidating administration in certain areas, directly challenging the military regime.
wow.
But simultaneously, we're seeing continued and brutal aerial attacks on civilian populations.
That's awful. It sounds like such a fluid and dangerous situation.
It is.
So, what kind of resolutions are people even considering or hoping for in Myanmar at this point?
Well, the most optimistic scenario would be a transition towards democracy.
Right.
However, this hinges heavily on the resistance forces gaining sufficient strength
Right.
to effectively challenge and potentially overthrow the military junta.
Right.
There's also the possibility of increased international pressure,
Right.
through sanctions and other diplomatic means,
Yeah.
although historically those have had a limited impact.
Right. So realistically, what do you think we're going to see unfold?
Well, unfortunately, a prolonged conflict seems the most probable outcome.
Okay.
While the resistance appears to be making progress in eroding the military's control,
Okay.
there's also, a significant danger of a severe military crackdown,
Right.
which would inevitably lead to even greater civilian suffering
Right.
and increased regional instability.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about Sudan.
Yeah, so turning to Sudan, the situation there is even more dire,
Okay.
with over 4,600 reported fatalities in 2025.
Wow.
And what's particularly disheartening is the failure of multiple peace initiatives
Oh, wow.
involving, key international and regional actors,
Okay.
the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and the African Union.
Right.
And we're also witnessing mass displacement of people on a truly horrific scale.
It's just such a bleak picture. Are there any ways out of this cycle of violence for Sudan?
Well, the path most often discussed, theoretically,
Yeah.
is a power-sharing agreement between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces.
Okay.
However, as your sources indicate, previous attempts at such agreements have failed spectacularly.
Oh, wow.
So external mediation is clearly essential,
Right.
alongside a massive influx of humanitarian aid,
Yeah.
to address the widespread displacement and suffering.
Right. And this just raises so many questions in my mind
Yeah,
about the effectiveness of international intervention in these types of conflicts.
it really does.
So realistically then, what's the outlook for Sudan?
Well, regrettably, the potential for further fragmentation of Sudan seems very high.
Okay.
We could be looking at a protracted and devastating civil war.
Right.
The regional spillover effects are also a major concern,
Right.
particularly for neighboring countries like South Sudan and the wider Horn of Africa.
Right.
And there's a significant risk of worsening famine and further displacement across the entire region.
Guys, if you're finding this deep dive valuable, please share it with anyone who might find it useful.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so let's move our focus now to Ethiopia and the Sahel region.
Okay,
Despite some fragile signs of peace in Tigray,
right.
Ethiopia has still seen over 2,000 reported fatalities in 2025, according to Wikipedia,
Right.
which suggests that, there are still underlying tensions
There are,
in
yeah.
other parts of the country.
Yeah, that's correct.
So what's the potential path forward for Ethiopia?
Well, the potential path forward hinges on the continuation of reconciliation efforts,
Okay.
the effective disarmament of any remaining armed groups,
Right.
and a meaningful political dialogue
Okay.
that addresses the fundamental ethnic tensions.
Right.
Continued international support for strengthening governance institutions will also be crucial.
Right. So realistically, what do we think is going to happen?
Well, the fragile peace currently holding may indeed persist.
Okay.
However, those deep-seated ethnic and political divisions
Yeah.
represent a significant vulnerability.
Okay.
And if those aren't addressed in a comprehensive and inclusive manner,
Yeah.
the risk of renewed conflict is definitely present,
Right.
which could obviously have destabilizing effects on the wider region.
Of course. Okay. So now the Sahel region.
Yeah, so the Sahel region presents kind of a different but equally challenging set of circumstances.
Okay.
We've seen nearly 4,000 reported fatalities this year.
Oh.
And ACLED highlights this increasing instability,
Okay.
fueled by active jihadist groups like JNAM and ISAHEL,
Right.
particularly in the border areas between Nigeria and Nigeria.
It just feels like that whole region is so volatile.
It is.
What kind of potential solutions are people exploring to even try to address this widespread instability?
Well, military interventions, often led by external actors such as France and ECOWAS,
Right.
have been a common response.
Right.
However, the sources suggest that these are often, a temporary measure at best.
Yeah.
Long-term solutions require tackling the root causes of instability,
Right.
which are, improving governance,
Right.
fostering sustainable economic development,
Right.
and countering the influence of external actors like Russia and Iran, who are reportedly increasing their presence in the region.
I see. What do you see as a key obstacle to, achieving stability in the Sahel?
Well, I think those deeply entrenched governance challenges is so difficult to overcome.
Yeah.
And when you add factors like climate change, as ACLED points out,
Yeah.
exacerbating resource scarcity,
Right.
it creates a really complex and combustible mix that fuels instability.
Yeah, it's so layered and complicated.
It is.
Okay, so realistically, what's the outlook for the Sahel region?
Well, sadly, without significant progress in addressing those fundamental issues
Right.
of governance and economic opportunity, the instability is likely to persist
Okay.
and potentially even spread to other countries in West Africa.
Right.
And as you mentioned, climate change acts as a major threat multiplier,
Right.
intensifying existing tensions over scarce resources
Right.
and potentially fueling further recruitment and conflict.
Guys, don't forget to subscribe to The Other Opinion for more deep dives like this one.
Yes,
Okay, so beyond these major areas of conflict,
right.
our sources also briefly touch on some other regions of concern.
Okay,
Things like the rise of militancy in Pakistan, the challenges facing the total peace strategy in Colombia,
right.
and the deeply troubling increase in the lethality of gang violence in Mexico.
Right.
And it just, makes me think about how conflict
Yeah.
in its various forms
Yeah.
is just so pervasive across the globe.
Absolutely. And when we step back to consider that broader global picture,
Yeah.
that interconnectedness we discussed at the beginning becomes even more apparent.
Yes.
The Middle East's impact on global energy markets,
Right.
the implications of the Russia-Ukraine war for NATO and European security,
Right.
and how climate change and resource scarcity exacerbate conflicts in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa.
Yeah.
It all points to this very tightly interwoven global security landscape.
Yeah.
We're also seeing severe humanitarian crises unfolding
Yeah.
across all these regions with millions upon millions of people displaced from their homes.
It's so awful.
What other opinions do you have on the interconnectedness of these conflicts? Let us know in the comments.
Yeah, let us know. There's so much talk about the importance of international diplomacy and cooperation,
Right.
but it often feels like, geopolitical rivalries and competing interests
Yeah.
are constantly hindering any kind of effective solutions.
Absolutely.
And it just makes it so much harder to achieve lasting peace.
Yeah.
And the CFR's own Preventive Priority Survey is really concerning.
It is.
It identifies 2025 as potentially a very dangerous year for global stability.
It certainly does.
What's the takeaway here?
Well, the crucial takeaway seems to be that while we might witness, temporary lulls in fighting
Yeah.
or localized ceasefires,
Right.
achieving lasting peace isn't simply about silencing the guns.
Right.
It requires addressing those deep-seated underlying issues.
Right.
The political grievances, the long-standing territorial disputes, the economic inequalities
Yeah.
that often fuel these conflicts in the first place.
Right.
And without significant and fundamental changes in these areas,
Yeah.
the unfortunate reality is that many of these conflicts are likely to persist.
Yeah.
And some may even escalate further.
Yeah. So to kind of bring it all together, this deep dive into the current state of global conflicts in 2025
Yeah.
really just highlights how complex and interconnected all of these challenges that we're facing are.
It does.
And for the majority of these situations, there just aren't any easy or immediate solutions on the horizon.
Right.
And while, temporary pauses in violence are certainly welcome,
Yeah.
they really don't address the fundamental drivers of these ongoing wars.
Exactly. To truly understand these situations and to really, hope for lasting peace, we need to look beyond the immediate triggers of conflict
Right.
and really delve into those often, deep-rooted underlying causes.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how these seemingly localized conflicts
Right.
can have such far-reaching and unexpected global consequences.
Yeah.
Affecting everything from energy prices to the stability of international alliances.
Absolutely.
And it begs the question, what responsibility do we as global citizens have
Right.
to try and understand these incredibly complex webs of conflict?
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive here on The Other Opinion.
Yes, thank you.
If you guys found this informative, please like this deep dive, leave a comment with your other opinions, subscribe to our channel for more in-depth discussions,
Yes.
and please share this with anyone who might find it valuable.
Yeah.
We aim to bring you a fresh perspective on important global issues.
Absolutely.
Finally, please be aware that this deep dive was created using AI to process and synthesize information from the provided sources.
Right.
While we strive for accuracy, some of the information presented may contain errors or be incomplete.
Yes,
So please always consult original sources for critical information.
that's right.
Thank again, everybody, for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
We'll see you next time.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.